Doctor, please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly state that the testimony you may give in the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may be seated. Please state your name for the record. Spell your first and last names.
Paul F. White, Paul-W-H-I-T-E.
Dr. White, good afternoon, sir.
Thank you.
You have been present during the testimony of other witnesses and have heard the admonitions to those witnesses?
Yes, I have.
Is that acceptable, sir?
Absolutely.
Thank you. At this time, direct examination, Mr. Flanagan.
Your Honor, could I ask for some water? I'm a little bit
I
dry.
think you're entitled, just as every other witness has been. Do you want the water before you begin?
If I could,
You may.
please.
All right, thank you. One moment, please. Thank you, Deputy Jones. Direct examination, Mr. Flanagan.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. White, you're basically retired now, aren't you?
Well, if you ask my wife, I don't think she would agree.
You're basically consulting now?
Well, I'm consulting, and I'm also responsible for clinical research projects at institutions in the U.S. and abroad.
Okay. When did you retire from the active anesthesiology business?
I retired from the University of Texas Southwestern last September.
Okay. Now, prior to your retirement, what was your occupation?
I was a practicing anesthesiologist and conducted a lot of research related to acute and chronic pain management.
What's your educational background to qualify you to practice in this field? Well, let's start with high school. You a local guy?
Graduated from Indio High School.
Where'd you go after Indio?
I went to University of California at Berkeley, or Cal.
What'd you major in there?
I majored in biochemistry.
And you finished that in 1970?
Yes, in 1970 I graduated from Berkeley.
What'd you do after Berkeley?
For 1 year I worked as a research chemist at Biorad Labs in Richmond, California.
Doing what?
Actually working on an FDA project, developing a project for submittal as an FDA device.
You say you did that for 1 year. What'd you do next?
Actually, I started graduate school at Scripps Institute of Oceanography in San Diego.
And what were you doing there?
I was doing microbial research, biochemical research.
And you say you went there 1 year. Is that a 1 year program?
No, actually, I only attended for about 6 months because I developed a renal problem that led to some extensive medical testing and actually piqued my interest in eventually doing medical research.
So what did you do in pursuit of that?
I applied to graduate school at the University of California, San Francisco, specifically in pharmacology because I had an interest in drug development and studying drugs for the treatment of diseases.
You applied for that. Were you accepted?
Yes, I was.
And did you graduate?
Yes, I completed a PhD in pharmacology at UCSF.
When did you complete your PhD?
Well, I actually, 2 years into the program, I decided that because of my interest in doing clinical research ultimately, that I should apply to medical school. So I actually did a combined program, and I obtained both degrees from UCSF in 1977.
So, and the degrees that you obtained were what?
Well, the PhD in pharmacology and a medical degree.
And after you got your medical degree, that was 1977?
Yes, sir.
Is there an internship required?
Yes.
Where'd you do that?
I was accepted into the internal medicine internship and residency program at UC San Francisco.
And how long a program was that?
Well, I was able, because I was eventually planning to go into anesthesiology, to do what's called fast track. So I was able to save 1 year on my residency because I was doing a second residency, namely anesthesiology.
And the anesthesiology residency, how long a program is that?
Well, at the time I completed the program, it was only 2 years. Now it's 3 years.
And so you completed that when?
In 1980, I think.
After completing your residency in anesthesiology, what'd you next do?
I accepted a faculty position at Stanford University in the Department of Anesthesiology.
What was that faculty position?
I was the director of ambulatory or outpatient anesthesia and assistant professor of anesthesiology.
And when you accepted that faculty position, had you basically completed your formal education?
Yes, finally.
So that was that, about 14 years of medical school and residency and internship and PhD?
Oh, more like 10 years.
10?
Yeah.
Yes, you got your bachelor's degree at 70. You've completed the rest of your medical education by 80. Now,
Is that right?
Yes.
in addition to, once you completed that education, were you licensed in by any agencies?
Well, it was about 2 years later. I first of all took the exams for board certification in internal medicine, and I obtained my medicine boards. And then a year later, I think it was 1981, I obtained my board certification in anesthesiology. So I have dual certification.
So you're now a licensed MD. In what states?
In Texas and California.
And you're board certified in what specialties?
In internal medicine and anesthesiology.
Now, what university appointments have you had the opportunity to take during your career?
Well, my initial appointment was as an assistant professor at Stanford University and director of the ambulatory surgery unit. And then in 1988, I was offered the position of professor and vice chairman of the Department of Anesthesiology at Washington University in St. Louis. And following that, in 1992, I was offered the position of professor and holder of an endowed chair of anesthesiology at the University of Texas. And along with that, I was the chairman of the department.
Do you have any hospital affiliations?
At which institution? At Texas?
Anywhere. Are you affiliated with any hospitals?
At the present time?
Yes.
Yes. Currently, I'm affiliated as a visiting scientist at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, where I direct research for the Department of Anesthesiology.
Now, I don't want you to be too shy, but in looking at your CV, there's listed about 20, 25 honors that you received. Just tell us a couple that are most significant to you.
Well, I guess the ones that mean the most to me are as one of the founding members of the Society for Ambulatory Anesthesia to receive the Distinguished Service Award. I've also been awarded an honorary fellowship from the Australasian College of Surgeons and Anesthetists, and I've been asked to give various honorary lectureships around the world.
So an honorary fellowship, is that like when you give a speech or a commencement address, they give you an honorary degree?
Well, it was more than a commencement address. I actually had to travel to multiple cities in Australia and give many lectures. And they typically honor one individual from North America every 2 years.
And when you're giving these lectures, what's the topic that you lecture on?
Well, the most common topic I'm asked to address relates to pharmacology of newer drugs and techniques for ambulatory or day surgery. But I also frequently address topics related to acute pain management.
You use the term ambulatory surgery. What does that mean?
Well, ambulatory surgery or day surgery commonly refers to procedures where patients are discharged home on the day of surgery, although it often includes what we call short stay surgery, which means patients are hospitalized overnight but are discharged prior to 24 hours.
Well, you indicated that when you went to Stanford that you were a director of ambulatory surgery?
Director of outpatient anesthesia or ambulatory anesthesia. It was a new position because the specialty was in its infancy, I would say.
Well, while you were doing this directorship at Stanford, what was your main interest as it related to anesthesiology?
Well, as the field was expanding, that is, more surgical procedures were being shifted from hospital-based or inpatient to ambulatory procedures, I was focused on developing techniques which would allow patients to recover faster and return home and resume their normal activities of daily living. So my focus was on drugs and techniques that would facilitate that process.
And when you were first starting in ambulatory procedures at Stanford, what was the drugs of choice? What were the drugs of choice?
Well, there were many fewer drugs than we use today. The most common IV anesthetic was thiopental, also known as pentothal, and a shorter-acting barbiturate known as methohexatol or Brevital, as well as the commonly used gaseous or volatile anesthetics, halothane and isoflurane, and nitrous oxide.
In your capacity at Stanford, you were looking for new drugs that didn't have these side effects?
Yes, as a clinical pharmacologist, I was familiar with many new innovative drugs. And one of the drugs that I was introduced to by a colleague from Europe, Professor John Dundee, who is considered the father of intravenous anesthesia, was a novel compound known as Propofol, which was being studied in the early stages in the United Kingdom and in Belgium.
Now, is this a drug that was being used anywhere?
It was being used in investigational studies in Europe. However, at the time there was a problem because it was water insoluble, so it was solubilized in a chemophore solvent, and the chemophores can be associated with severe allergic reactions. So although the drug was very effective, the allergic reactions led to its withdrawal from the market in England and in Europe.
So what did you do to pursue investigation of this drug?
Well, in chatting with Professor Dundee, he suggested that I contact Imperial Chemical Industries, or ICI, who were working on developing a new formulation of Propofol, which involved a lipid emulsion, like intralipid, a white milky emulsion, to solubilize the drug and avoid the allergic complications.
So before developing the white liquid, was it a clear?
Yeah, it was a clear solvent. It had some viscosity, thicker viscosity than water, but yes, it was clear.
Okay, and so how did you go about commencing your investigation of this drug?
Well, I was a very young professor, and although I had some reputation because as part of my residency and graduate school work, I wrote some key papers on ketamine, another anesthetic, and separated the isomers of ketamine, one of which is now commercialized in Europe. But I contacted the company, ICI, in the UK and asked about the possibility of becoming involved in early studies with the new emulsion formulation of Propofol when it would be introduced in the US. And they introduced me to Stewart Pharmaceutical in Delaware, which was the company that was going to be responsible for organizing the studies in the US.
So when you pursued this with Stewart Pharmaceutical, what did you do?
Well, I called up the representative. Stewart Pharmaceutical, interestingly, is not an anesthesia company. They actually are most well known for antacids. In particular, Mylanta was their big product. So they weren't terribly familiar with anesthesia, and they were very appreciative of input from anesthesiologists at this stage. And I suggested a study that I thought could have great importance because in the ambulatory setting, as I mentioned, the barbiturates which we used had hangover effects and also a high incidence of nausea and vomiting when they were used.
Did they accommodate you in allowing you to study their drug?
Well, I developed a protocol, and it went through review within the company, and they said it sounds interesting. We would support you doing this study, which means they provided a grant for the study, for me to conduct the study, and I obtained Institutional Review Board approval at Stanford and commenced the study in 1993, 94.
What year?
No, I'm sorry, 1983 or 84. I misstated that.
And what was the object of your study? Well, first of all, strike that. They didn't just send you a bucket of Propofol. They wanted to know what you're going to do with it first. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a lengthy process. The protocols are reviewed internally within the company. And of course, I have a lengthy process at my local institution. So it takes several months to, even after the company gives you the go-ahead, to be able to think about organizing.
Now, when you use the term a protocol, what is a protocol?
It's sort of a template for conducting a clinical study. It describes inclusion, exclusion criteria for patients, the objectives of the study, obviously the detailed methodology that will be used, how the data will be analyzed, and provides a background as to the rationale for conducting the study.
So before they send you any drug or any of the Propofol, they want to know exactly what you're going to do with it.
Yeah, they want to read the detailed protocol, correct.
And then they want to know what criteria you're looking for, how you're going to evaluate your criteria, and things of that nature.
Yeah, very detailed methodology is required.
How long did that take you to get that protocol to them?
Well, in those days, things moved quicker than today, so I was able to get that completed in about 6 months.
And did you have any help in developing the protocol, or is this something you did by yourself?
Well, in those days, I was on my own. As a young professor, I didn't have postdocs, fellows, and there were some medical students that would help me out with projects.
So you got to go to your school or your university, get their permission, develop a protocol, send it to them, have them approve it, and then you can start studying it.
Yes, of course, the company has to approve it first because otherwise I can't obtain the investigational drug.
Okay. Now, once you got past the point where they approved your protocol and were willing to send you the drug, what was the next step?
Well, you organize with your surgical colleagues appropriate patient populations to study. I was fortunately able to recruit 2 excellent Stanford medical students to help me with the project. And we got started pretty quickly.
And
I might add the study was to compare Propofol, this new formulation, to the standard at the time, which was the short-acting barbiturate methohexatol. So it was a direct comparison, and both groups also got nitrous oxide for induction and maintenance of general anesthesia.
So basically, you had done a couple papers before this, but this was one of your early papers. Is that correct?
Well, I had done several papers. As I mentioned, my PhD thesis was based on the IV anesthetic ketamine and its pharmacology in animals and in humans. So I had probably 10 or 15 publications by the time I started my position at Stanford University.
Your interest was basically in IV anesthetics.
Yeah, I started working in the area when I was a grad student and was fascinated by IV anesthesia. And then after meeting Professor Dundee, my interest kind of grew.
Before then, what was normally used for an anesthetic?
Well, the normal anesthetic involves giving an intravenous drug to put patients to sleep. Many patients think, oh, I just got an IV anesthetic. But in the U.S., typically, once you lose consciousness, then the anesthesiologist will turn on a vaporizer and administer what's called a volatile or gaseous anesthetic, along with nitrous oxide, although nowadays nitrous oxide is being used less commonly because of concerns about environmental pollution.
So before you ever actually investigated Propofol, you published 15 papers?
I would say approximately, yes.
How many papers have you published relating to your field of anesthesiology?
Close to 450 peer-reviewed publications.
What's a peer review publication?
Well, that's where a manuscript is submitted to a journal and it's sent out for review by experts in the field, and then generally there are various modifications that are made, and if you're successful and I guess a bit lucky, it's accepted for publication. And the process takes about a year all total.
So you send out your manuscript, which is your study, which usually involves protocol, the actual investigation, the conclusion. You send that out to a journal and ask them to publish it.
Correct.
They evaluate whether they're going to publish it based upon what they perceive as the merits of the study.
Yeah, it's typically reviewed by 3 experts in the field, and you get back their comments. They're generally blinded, but some reviewers reveal their names. So,
now, you've actually had 435 published?
well, there's a few others that are in lesser journals that I don't list. But yes, that's the number of publications on called PubMed, which is a common reference source.
Okay, after doing the first 15 and you started on Propofol, did you have a series of studies that were published concerning Propofol?
Yeah, after completing the initial study, which demonstrated that using Propofol instead of the barbiturate allowed patients to not only awaken quicker but ambulate sooner, and they had 50% less postoperative nausea and vomiting. And it was very exciting. I mean, there was a press conference with a local TV station and tremendous interest in the potential of this drug for day surgery. And after that, I went back to the company and asked them if I could perform a follow-up study in patients having major surgery where we would focus on trying to understand the pharmacokinetics and dynamics of the drugs so we could use it better during surgery. As you pointed out earlier, that it was not usual to use an IV anesthetic for induction and maintenance of anesthesia in the U.S. So we needed to kind of define the parameters of dose and response.
Now, at the time that you're doing this, Propofol's not even FDA approved, is it?
Oh, no. This is 1986, and it was approved in 1989 for use in general anesthesia.
So you had spent 6, 7 years researching Propofol before you could finally even get it approved for use in the United States?
Well, I don't get it approved. The FDA does the approving, and the company submits it. But I started working with Propofol in 1983, and it was approved 6 years later in 1996. In 1986, I apologize.
Since you started studying this and writing papers on it, Your Honor, I have an exhibit I'd like to mark as, and it's next.
Triple X.
Triple F.
Triple X.
Referring to Triple X, Dr. Schaefer, is this an itemization of 36 studies that you've done that deal with Propofol?
I'm Dr. White.
I mean, Dr.
but
White, excuse me.
Dr. White, Dr. Schaefer's a good friend, and he actually helped me on one of the papers.
I'm showing you Exhibit Triple X. That involves page one. Your Honor, it's a 6-page document. The first 3 pages constitute an itemization of 36 studies done by Dr. White involving Propofol only. Is that correct, Doctor?
Yes, it is. And the study I was referring to actually as the first study, which was conducted in the U.S., was the comparison of Propofol with methotrexate, and that's published in 1986.
That's number 4 on it.
That's number 4, yes, sir.
Now, you published in 86. When did you start the study?
The study was started in about 1983.
So it's a 3-year study. Now, I noticed that...
No, the study was completed within 6 to 8 months. But it requires time to analyze the results, to prepare the manuscript, and to go through the review process, and then the publication delays. So that's not unusual.
I noticed that your name is the third name up there. There's Doe's, looks like Westfall, and White. Was this Doe's study, or was it your study?
Well, Van Does and Westfall were both medical students at Stanford, so it was my study, and I conducted the anesthesia.
How come your name appears last?
Because frequently as a senior author or principal investigator, you'll put your name in either the last position or the third position if there are many more authors.
I noticed there's a lot of studies up there. Your name is in the I guess those are when you're the only one on the study. Looking at number 9, I see the name Schaefer, A. Was that another study done by you?
Yes, it is.
Who was the principal investigator on that?
Well, I designed the study, organized the study, and Dr. Audrey Schaefer was my second fellow. So she had actually just completed medical school. She had not had any postgraduate training in anesthesia, but she had completed her medical education. And Van Does, again, was a medical student. And then Stephen Schaefer, who was also a medical student at the time, helped out with aspects of the data analysis and modeling.
And you set up the parameters for the study?
Yes.
Now, both Schaefers, they were Mr. or Dr. and Dr. Schaefer?
Yes, they
were
married.
When did you meet them?
I met the Schaefers probably in 1981, shortly after I arrived at Stanford. They came by to talk to me about doing research in anesthesia.
In addition to these studies that you've published, have you done any research investigation regarding benzodiazepines?
Yes, I actually did one of the first studies with midazolam when it was introduced for sedation during local anesthesia with some plastic surgery colleagues, and a study involving using midazolam for induction of anesthesia in the mid-1970s. Midazolam is also known as Versed. It remains a very popular sedative.
I note that there's 18 studies listed under the relevant clinical studies involving benzodiazepines. Is that 18 studies that you've done involving benzodiazepines?
Well, that's probably an approximation. I'm not saying they all were totally focused on benzodiazepines, but benzodiazepines were a part of the study. Many of them were studies specifically targeting the use of benzodiazepines in the operating room and also in the intensive care unit for sedation.
During your career, how many books have you read or written?
Probably
Well,
written.
excuse me.
Written.
Why don't you re-ask?
During your career as an anesthesiologist, subsequent to your graduation or completion of an internship, have you written some books?
I think I've written approximately 15 books, 2 of which are major textbooks for the specialty, one on ambulatory anesthesia and surgery, or 2 actually on that topic, and one on intravenous anesthesia.
This triple X, you've itemized 5 textbooks. Are those ones relating to Propofol?
Yes, not only Propofol, but actually drug manuals, which talk about all the drugs that we use in the perioperative period, which means the time around surgery.
And in addition to writing books, are there chapters that you've written for books?
Yeah, I've written chapters on intravenous anesthesia and ambulatory anesthesia and surgery for most of the major textbooks in the specialty,
And
including my own.
you've written 21 separate chapters?
It's actually 88.
Well, I'm talking about just relating to Propofol.
Yes, that's probably a good approximation.
Now, Doctor, how were you contacted in this case?
Well, I think it was in January of this year, actually. I got a phone call sort of from you just out of the blue. I was working from my home office, and you called and introduced yourself and mentioned the name Conrad Murray.
Was that name familiar to you?
Yes, I had heard the name, and I think I paused and was quiet for a minute.
Okay, and when I mentioned that name and I mentioned the case involving the death of Michael Jackson,
Yes, you did.
what were your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts were I really wasn't sure that I wanted to get involved in a high-profile celebrity case involving the death of an icon.
Why not?
I'm just not a public person, and I really don't enjoy all the attention.
Was it my persistence that caused you to look further in this case, or was it some other reason?
Well, in honesty, my wife said I shouldn't say no so quickly, and I think what I suggested to you was, could you send me some materials? When I first heard about the case, I had heard suggestions as to what the causes were, and because I'm very familiar with these drugs, especially Propofol and opioids, narcotic drugs were mentioned, I said I agreed to review materials for you. I think it was in early February, and upon review, I would let you know whether I was willing to become involved as part of the defense.
Now, this deal immediately with the elephant in the room here.
Elephant in the room. Okay.
The elephant in the room being Conrad Murray has been accused of infusing a dose of Propofol and leaving this patient. Can you justify that?
Absolutely not.
Well, after I sent you the papers, did you automatically agree then? What did I send you? Do you recall what you had at that time?
Again, I may miss some items, but you sent me Dr. Murray's interview with the LAPD. You sent me the coroner report, toxicology, a plethora of expert documents.
13 expert opinions prior to Dr. Schaefer's?
It was a pretty thick packet. And I think that was all that I recall at the moment.
Did I send you some court testimony from witnesses that appeared at the preliminary hearing?
Yes, I believe you did.
Was
Correct.
that Dr. Ruffalo, Dr. Rogers?
Yes, it was.
Now, I take it you ended up reading all of that?
Yes, I read all these documents, and I was somewhat perplexed as to how the determination had been made by essentially all of the experts that Dr. Murray was infusing propofol, because in my examination of the documents and the evidence that was described, it wasn't obvious to me. And I thought that there were questions if, in fact, Murray had administered the drugs that he described in his conversations with the police department and the doses that he described. I would not have expected Michael Jackson to have died.
So did you, as a result of reviewing these documents, did you automatically say, yeah, I'm on board?
No, I did not. I actually...
What was your next request?
Well, I think I told you that I would like to meet face-to-face with Dr. Murray, and that
The objection is overruled. The answer remains.
I asked for
That's
the...
all right. That's the answer. The recent partial answer is stricken.
Okay.
Mr. Flanagan, pursuant to discussions.
When you requested, when you said you'd like to meet with Dr. Murray, did you ever have that meeting?
The objection is sustained. 350, 352. Thank you.
Well, prior to making your decision to...
May we approach, Your Honor?
You may. Give us a moment. Dr. Schaefer, Dr. White, we've had everybody
Do we
asking
look
for
the same?
water. Not at all, and I'm sorry too.
It's all right.
Dr. White, did you want some more water?
I did.
Thank you, sir. Give us a moment.
I can proceed. I just get a little dry
Yeah, we'll
when
wait
I'm
a moment.
talking.
I think that's Deputy Jones, and I think I can identify you. I apologize. Dr. White has the water. Mr. Flanagan.
Dr. White, you flew to Southern California.
Overruled. You can finish it.
And you met with me.
Yeah, I flew to Los Angeles because I have a part-time job, as I mentioned, directing research at Cedars. So I was also visiting Cedars-Sinai at that time and met with you in your office, correct? You and Mr. Chernoff.
You agreed to undertake investigation of this case.
After our meeting, I agreed that I would participate, yes.
Now, were you supplied additional information, the remaining transcripts involving the preliminary hearing?
I believe I was. That would have been sometime, I guess, in February, mid-February, yes.
Now, you developed some preliminary conclusions in this case as a result of your review of the prosecution's evidence at the preliminary hearing and their medical reports?
I did prepare a very brief document. You contacted me and asked for a very brief opinion letter towards the end of February, I believe, and I had a lot of other responsibilities, so I prepared, I think, a 3-page letter.
And at that point in time, you formed some conclusions in that letter that you don't currently hold. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You thought at the time when you sent that letter that the oral ingestion of Propofol might have played a part in this case?
Well, yes, I did, because there was a small amount of Propofol and lidocaine in Mr. Jackson's stomach, and some of the experts that had reviewed the documents had also suggested that possibility, but it certainly was a speculative remark, and I think I suggested that there were no studies demonstrating the bioavailability of oral propofol in either human or animals that I was aware of. And so I suggested that could be a possibility.
Now, when you came up with this conclusion that oral propofol was possibly playing a major part in this case, had there been any studies that you were aware of at the time regarding bioavailability of propofol if taken orally?
No, but I would just like to correct, I didn't draw conclusions. It was merely just speculating on some possibilities of things that could have contributed.
Okay, and so you've done 36 studies involving propofol. Have you ever investigated the bioavailability? Let's get a definition of that term. When I say oral bioavailability, what does that mean?
That means how much of a drug that's given via oral administration and then absorbed into the what we call systemic circulation, into the body, is in an active form. So a drug with a high bioavailability means you could take a pill, say a 1 milligram pill, and the effect on the body overall would be 1 milligram, just as if you gave it intravenously. In other words, it's 100% bioavailable. Drugs that have a low bioavailability are drugs that when you take them orally, only a fraction of the active drug actually reaches the circulation and reaches the sites of action. In the case of the drugs we're discussing in this case, it's the central nervous system or the brain for the most part.
And so, at that particular point in time, were you aware of that? I'll refer to it as the pig study of 1992, cited in Dr. Schaefer's report.
Actually, I only became aware of it when I was provided with a copy of Dr. Schaefer's initial report. When I did my search online, I did oral administration, and the piglet study, which involved intrarectal administration, did not come up in my search, so I was unaware of it.
Now, you are aware of the fact that there actually has been a human study done involving bioavailability of propofol. Is that correct?
Yes, I am aware of the study. Actually, my colleague Dr. Schaefer and colleagues in Santiago, Chile, conducted a study in 6 volunteers very recently, and they prepared a draft manuscript which Dr. Schaefer asked me to review. And also, Dr. Schaefer himself actually drank propofol. I felt kind of bad because I said, I hate to think you drank that just because I speculated on something due to a lack of evidence to the contrary.
As a result of the Chilean study, you did review it completely?
Yes.
Did you make comments on it?
I made some suggestions, and I had comments that there were problems with the study, in my opinion. It was not a controlled study. It was not a blinded study, and in fact, one or more of the 6 participants were actually investigators. I'm not sure how you get consent for your own study, but the principal investigator, Pablo Sepulveda, was one of the 6 volunteers for the study. So I thought that because there's no blinding, I don't know that you can put a lot of value on the assessments that were made because they were subjective assessments of drug effect.
This is not how you do your studies.
Well, most of the time when we do studies involving drugs, we like to have a placebo or active comparator, and we try to blind the observers, and so we do what's called double-blind studies with drugs in general, and or have an active comparator, which is a drug that has an effect, so that you could really be sure that you're not looking at an effect that's unbiased.
Now, when you say double-blind, are you talking about the subjects being blind to it and the observers of the subjects both being blind?
Correct.
Not knowing who's got drugs and who's got the placebo.
Well, who's got the active drug versus who's got the placebo. Correct.
So this study from Chile was not a blind study.
Not that I could determine.
And was there a determination made as to bioavailability?
5 out of the 6 subjects had no evidence of any bioavailability. But interestingly, one of the subjects, actually the principal investigator, Dr. Sepulveda, who's also a personal friend of mine, had fairly substantial levels. I think at 2 minutes he had a level which was about 2 micrograms per mil, which is actually only slightly lower than the level of propofol that was reported in Michael Jackson's femoral blood sample.
Now, did you conclude from that maybe it's bioavailable in some people and maybe some people it's not?
Well, I agree with Dr. Schaefer. I don't think it's bioavailable from the stomach, but when you take something orally, it passes through your oral mucosa, your hypopharynx, and through your esophagus, and that mucosa can absorb drugs. And I suspect that in this case, the one volunteer, Dr. Sepulveda, that had the high levels, it was probably transmucosal absorption from the oral pharynx or the esophagus.
And has there been subsequent animal studies or an animal study that indicated to you that absorption through the stomach is really not going to lead to appreciable levels in the blood system.
Well, yes, you recall when I initially wrote the letter speculating on this as a possibility, I suggested that we commission a study in animals where the drug would be placed directly into the stomach using a tube that we put down. It's very benign, doesn't hurt the animals, and administer the drug and determine if there was effect in animals, because I wouldn't have pursued a study in humans until I had first done an animal study. And we did this study. We didn't publish it because I didn't think it was necessarily appropriate for publication. It was negative. The drug that was given directly into the stomach was absorbed and metabolized, and there was no effect.
And did you want to confirm the fact that the drug couldn't be absorbed through the stomach in spite? Well, there had been an animal study, a pig study, where a rectal insertion of the drug was used. Did you think that there was a possibility of a difference between the other end of the gastrointestinal system?
Well, as Dr. Schaefer stated, when you give a drug rectally, it does partially go through the hepatocirculation, but most of it, but a lot of it can bypass the liver, so it's not the same model. I don't think it's as convincing. So that's why I felt it was appropriate to do an animal study. In the study we commissioned, none of the animals were harmed. They basically had no effect, and so it was no harm. And it answered the question clearly that if you put propofol directly in the stomach, you wouldn't expect or find a clinical effect.
Okay, and you've discussed this study with Dr. Schaefer, I presume? Oh, the Sepulveda study?
Yeah, we discussed the paper in email exchanges just a few weeks ago, but interestingly, we also had an opportunity to chat during the proceedings here when we were outside in the ante room while the video was being reviewed. And it was an interesting chat because we talked about the volunteer with the high propofol level, and we both agreed that it could be oral transmucosal absorption, and talked about actually the possibility of developing a lollipop with propofol that could be used for sedating patients non-invasively, that is, without giving it intravenously.
But so it piques your interest as a possibility of a future look at usefulness of propofol.
Correct. And I have to also acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Schaefer, because it was not just my idea. It was something we discussed together.
Now, did you published papers with the Schaefers?
I published one paper with Steve and 9 papers with his former wife, Audrey. Audrey spent 1 year with me while Steve was still in medical school. She was a year ahead of him in medical school. And then they went away and did their internship and residency at the University of Pennsylvania. And upon returning to Stanford, Audrey wanted to do a second year of research with me. So she rejoined my group. And that's why she has many more publications.
Did any of these papers have anything that would be relevant in this case?
Yes. I mean, the most important one probably is the pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic effects of propofol, which has been considered one of the classics in the field. In fact, I was asked to write a special article discussing propofol for the major journal Anesthesiology, and it was referred to classic article revisited.
Now, this pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamics, what is the difference between the two?
Well, Dr. Schaefer spent a lot of time, so I don't want to bore the jurors unnecessarily, but in a simple way, the way I think of pharmacokinetics, it's a relationship between a dose that you administer to a patient and the resultant blood level. Pharmacodynamics, on the other hand, is the relationship between that blood level and an effect on an appropriate organ. Dr. Schaefer talked about effect site concentration, which is a surrogate endpoint, or it's a way of assessing drug effect on the brain. And since we're talking about anesthetic drugs, sedative drugs, that's the critically important organ. Most practitioners, however, aren't really too interested in the blood level because you can't measure it, and certainly not the brain level. And so we look at the effect, the relationship between a dose and an effect. So it kind of goes directly to the end effect. But when we think of PK/PD, we're breaking down the dose-effect relationship in patients into two steps.
Now, when you're talking about pharmacodynamics or pharmacokinetics, correct me if I'm wrong, that's where you know the weight of a person or of a subject, you know the dose they get. It allows you to predict the blood level that you would expect.
We use models, as Dr. Schaefer has described, to get an approximation of a blood level. But as we'll show, it's not like there's a one-to-one relationship. You're often dealing with a five-fold variability. So if I give a fixed dose to a population of patients, the blood level that results will vary over a five-fold range.
What does five-fold mean?
500%.
I mean, you can get 500 times too much,
No,
or one-fifth?
Sorry, you get 5 times. So you could get, for example, if you give a dose of Propofol, you could get a blood level that could range from 1 microgram per mil to 5 micrograms per mil. That's just variability among patient populations. Similarly, there's a variation between the blood level and an effect within a patient population. Of course, we can determine means, and that's what we use in a lot of the modelings processes. But when you're dealing with individual patients, as we'll discuss later, I hope, I can demonstrate the challenge in looking at pharmacokinetics and dynamics.
So pharmacokinetics, you give a dose, you can get different blood levels, and then pharmacodynamics, you can get a certain blood level, but you get different effects on the patient.
At the same blood level, yes. In different patients, not necessarily the same patient. I'm talking about a population of patients.
This paper that you did with Dr. Schaefer involving PK/PD, pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, was that published?
Yes, it was published in Anesthesiology.
And does that illustrate the variability that you can get with doses and
Yes, I don't have a copy of the paper, but I guess you do.
I've got a copy of the paper.
Good.
And
just, again, I don't want to bore you all with unnecessary detail, but this is the administration of Propofol during surgery in this particular patient. These are the actual blood samples that we drew and measured of Propofol. And you can see that during the operation here, the solid line is Dr. Schaefer's modeling of the pharmacokinetics of the drug. And during surgery, you can see the model significantly under-predicted the actual blood levels. These are the actual blood levels. These were the levels that were predicted by the model. So I think it's just a good illustration of some of the variability that we're dealing with. And if you go to the next page of this article, I'll show you an example of what we call pharmacodynamic variability. There's another example of kinetic variability to the side, if you want to show that one. Again, where samples...
is the other one?
Yeah, you can see here, this is the model concentration, and here's one sample was below the curve, and then shortly thereafter, another sample was far above the curve.
Okay, could you explain that? What do we have on each of the axes?
Oh, I'm sorry. This is the propofol concentration, and this is the time. And this is the infusion rate here of propofol that was given for providing anesthesia.
You got all those dots. Do those represent patients?
Those are patient blood level. This is one patient.
It's
These
one
are
patient.
repeated blood samples, yes. In other words, each patient is used to generate a curve. We do this for every patient in the study.
What's the purpose of the line that's drawn?
The continuous line is just the model. It's basically to see how well the model predicts. You can see during the elimination of the drug, the model predicts very accurately. The dots are right on the curve. But during the surgery, there was tremendous variability, which...
So this is one patient
Yes.
being operated, that 100, 200, those times at the bottom of those minutes?
Yes, sir.
So this is a surgery that, does it mean that it lasted for about 100 minutes?
Yeah, the Propofol infusion was given for about 100 minutes, correct. The
And-
surgery may have been somewhat longer.
And each of those dots reflects the patient's blood level of Propofol during the surgery?
During and after the surgery, correct.
So was the infusion dose uniform?
No, it was a variable rate infusion.
And who does, is that something an anesthesiologist judges by looking at the patient, how he's doing?
Well, there are a variety of parameters that we monitor, physiologic parameters, blood pressure, heart rate. The patient has diaphoresis or sweating, things that we judge to make a determination of whether patients need more anesthesia.
So does this mean that you put a certain level in a patient, you can't actually predict with a great deal of precision exactly what that's going to mean in the patient in terms of blood level?
Yeah, that's correct. If you look to the right, figure 3, I think is a better example, I think, to your point. This is more an example of the pharmacodynamic variability. What we show here, again, are the Propofol blood concentrations during both major and non-major surgery. And these horizontal little bars represent the average for the population that we studied. And you can see this is situations where a patient was adequately anesthetized and situations where the patient was inadequately anesthetized. And, for example, during major surgery, patients that were adequately anesthetized on average had higher Propofol concentrations than those that were inadequately anesthetized. But you can clearly see that there were patients who, despite relatively low levels of Propofol, had adequate anesthesia. And conversely, there were patients here who had inadequate anesthesia despite high levels of Propofol. And the same pattern exists with the minor surgery. So that's an example of what I would consider pharmacodynamic variability.
With that kind of variability, how is it possible that you can do modeling, such as the simulations that Dr. Schaefer has prepared in this case?
Well, you can do modeling to get an understanding of how drugs might work in a population of patients. The challenge is using models to predict levels in a specific or individual patient.
Mr. Flanagan, you let me know when it's convenient to take the mid-afternoon break.
It's fine.
Is it? All right. Let's do that, ladies and gentlemen. We'll take the mid-afternoon break. Of course, please remember all the admonishments. Be about a 15-minute break. Thank you.